Okay, so actually I want to just recap with this quote from where we ended off last week. Talking about how emotions don't come in single file, they're not clean, there's usually not a direct one-to-one cause and effect with how you're feeling at the moment and why you're feeling that way at the moment. But this is good, and as our quote here says, mixed emotions are the right response to a mixed world. Life in this world means the delightful glories of God's handiwork always get the muck of sin and suffering spattered on them. We have no godly choice but to both mourn and to mourn. Okay, and so another reason why we're in this section here of emotions are complicated, another reason why is that they happen in your body. Right? These are not just abstract feelings floating around in the air. I don't think we know that, but have you ever just stop to think about that reality for a second, that a text message, reading words off of a phone can bring tears to your eyes or a smile to your face? Or watching a sporting event or some competition on TV can literally get you sweating and your heart beating fast. I remember back when the Bills, so like I said, something always with the Bills. The Bills were in the playoffs, right, and their first playoff game was a real nail-biter. I remember Hannah posting on Facebook that, what did she say? I have her written here. I went back and looked. I'm still catching my breath and I have a rash, but they did. But when you think about it, right, you're just watching something on TV and then your emotions get you all riled up. You feel it bodily. You feel it physically. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, actually. And so it's because our emotions influence our bodies and vice versa. Our bodies influence our emotions. Right? Think about it. Have you ever stubbed your toe? Right? Have you ever stubbed your toe and then not felt an emotion immediately afterwards? There's usually some emotion that comes with it, right? And that's purely just from feeling the physical pain. And so, but we have to remember that our bodies are good. They were designed for good. We have to remember that the reason emotions are complicated, the reason emotions happen in our body, is oftentimes, for survival. Right? You should only have to put your hand on the stove once, because the pain you felt in your body will be remembered with fear or trepidation the next time you see that hot stove. Right? And so the physical pain that is accompanied by that emotion, you're going to remember the emotion next time. It's going to help you avoid those dangerous or harmful situations the next time. This was God's design for our bodies and for our emotions. We just need this process to be sanctified. Our bodies are the messengers of our souls, and they cry aloud over and over again that we care deeply about the purpose, outcome, and experiences of our lives. In this sense, your body acts as a billboard displaying your emotions to you in the world, whether you want it to or not. Your body clearly worries that if it doesn't capture your attention, you might not listen to your heart's messages. Right? And so here is why the emotions and the bodies work together. Right? The soul and the body work together. The mind and the body work together. It's because your heart doesn't have a voice necessarily, right? But our bodies carry that message for us. Our bodies display that message to other people and to ourselves, right? And they do so in sometimes such a dramatic fashion to make sure it gets our attention, to make sure we understand that there's something here that we need to listen to. There's something here that we need to understand. Of course, at any point in time, if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to jump in. Another reason why our bodies or our emotions are complicated is because our bodies can and often do go wrong. Sometimes we're either too fast or too slow. When the body reacts too fast, we might call those triggers. I know that's a popular word, and most of us deal with those in some sense of the word. But you ever had a boss tell you, I need to talk to you at the end of the day? It's like 8 o'clock in the morning, and then all day long, immediately you're sweating, you're packing your stuff, and this is it, I knew this was coming, right? You have no idea what it is. That's an emotion reacting, or your body reacting with that emotion too fast. you don't really know what it is. You don't really necessarily have to gear up for some traumatic event. It might just be, an attaboy or something like that. But our emotions and our bodies react immediately sometimes. Or they react too slow. When you experience maybe a great or a sudden loss, right, something, and we see this often with someone whose spouse dies or their child dies, and they don't feel the way sometimes we feel like they should feel, or they don't express that feeling the way we do. Sometimes they dive into busy work, they dive into the planning, into all the logistics of losing someone, and we don't necessarily feel that emotion that we need to feel in the moment. It might come too slow. So God made us to respond to the world around us in the moment. When our bodies rush or delay that reaction, we begin to drift out of rhythm with reality. Our emotions start to pull us away from worshipful, trusting obedience rather than towards it. And so when our bodies rush or delay that reaction, we begin to drift out of rhythm with reality. Right? We are meant to respond in the moment. And so when we're responding too fast or responding too slow, we're not necessarily responding with what is appropriate for the moment in our reality. Our emotions can be too strong, or they can be too weak. Like we said, emotions motivate us, right? They are a way of putting our values into action. And so, some of you, I'm certainly not familiar with this, but going on a diet, right? You look in the mirror, and your shirt doesn't fit anymore, your buttons don't button on your pants, and you're like, that's it, I'm going on a diet. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's going to work. 50 pounds. Go. And then it might be like, I don't know, a couple days later, a week, a couple weeks later, right? And you just don't feel that same sense of urgency anymore, right? That emotion that initially motivated you when you first made that decision, really in a pretty emotional moment. You might not think of it as emotional, right? For some people who that really matters to, it might have been a very emotional moment, right? But nevertheless, that emotion wanes in weakness over time. I tell the guys that I work with at the prison, the second you leave prison, how you feel about prison is not strong enough to keep you out of prison, right? Because when you're in prison, you have all this stimuli around you to say, oh, I hate that, I can't stand that, I hate this food, I don't like that person, I hate not having the lights go off, whatever. You can list a million things, right? But as soon as you're not in that environment anymore, when you're in that environment, you have those stimuli to your emotions that motivate you, right? There's no one in prison that says, yeah, I'll probably be back. Or it's not so bad, I wouldn't mind if I come back. Most of them say, I'm never coming back here. And in all honesty, those are emotional decisions, right? They're just saying, I can't stand it here, I don't like it here, I'm not coming back here. But the second they're on the other side of the gate, it's just a memory. And it's just a memory of an emotion, a memory, really, of a motivation that isn't going to continue to motivate them as strongly as it once did when they're sitting in the middle of a prison cell. Right? Or they can be too strong. For example, preparing for a Sunday night seminar. Doing all the reading and the research and putting their thoughts to paper, making a beautiful PowerPoint slide. But then still being nervous, right? Still being a little bit anxious. The emotions that spurred me and motivated me to do well are lingering. Right? I don't need that emotion anymore, but I'm still dealing with it. Maybe even now, as we speak. This is one way to understand post-traumatic stress disorder, right? We have an intense traumatic experience that provokes great emotion, but often too much emotion for the next time. And then either too much or too little, right? You can have a steady stream of emotion that drowns out all other emotions. We said this is one of the reasons why emotions are complicated is because we feel a lot of things, we love a lot of things at all times. And so we don't get to just have one feeling drown out the rest of them, to be the most important feeling, the most important emotion. Or a lack of an emotional response where there should be. And you might know someone, or you yourself may have felt numb or just depressed, or just maybe even said before, I just don't feel anything anymore, right? And that's where your emotions are too little. Has anyone ever seen the movie Inside Out? It's a kid's movie. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil it for you. But, it's about the emotions inside this little girl's brain. And when she's really young and super immature, she only has one emotion. There's a control switch, right? And that's her control switch. That whatever emotion she's feeling at the moment sits at that control switch and controls all her behaviors, all of her thoughts, all of her actions. Right? It gets her into a lot of trouble. Right? She reacts emotionally often. She's a little girl, which they're prone to do. But as a coming of age, if you will, by the end of the movie, the control panel is got 10 seats in it. Right? And it really is a good depiction of the fact that all of your emotions should have a seat, should be influencing your behaviors and things like that, right? So we don't want to just single it out and make emotion too strong, or not let emotions have their influence in how we act and how we speak. Our bodies and our souls work in tandem. Sometimes the link is not obvious. Having a panic attack in the middle of a crowd, right? It's logical, that makes sense. Having one while you're sitting at home in the safety of your bedroom with someone with whom you feel safe, that link probably isn't as obvious, right? When you're out in public and you have a panic attack because you're surrounded by a lot of people, you feel like maybe there's no quick escape, your emotions start to feel it, your body starts to feel it. That link makes sense. But, right, there are going to be times you may have a panic attack or an anxiety attack, and you're not really sure why you feel that way. So emotions are complicated. They are a good thing, though. They tell us what we love, they connect us to each other, they put our values into actions, and they turn us to God. So, that was where we were supposed to finish last week. Any comments, thoughts, concerns? All right, so for tonight, we want to talk about why I can't control my emotions. Engaging emotions means engaging God, engaging emotions in our relationships, starting with healthy emotions, and nourishing the healthy ones. So, have you ever felt trapped in an emotion where you just feel depressed or angry or bitter? No matter what you do to try and get rid of that emotion or move into another emotion maybe, you just can't. Maybe you even prayed about it and you're just still mad, or you're still bitter, or you're still frustrated, whatever the case may be. Maybe you got into a disagreement with your spouse, right? And your emotions flare up and your pride flares up and you know you're wrong and you know he or she is right, but you're still mad, right? You can't just decide not to be mad anymore. You can't just decide, well, yeah, that was silly. I guess I'm not mad anymore. Right? You're probably still going to get mad. You're still going to be frustrated at least. So we have to find ways to work through that, right? And one of the things that makes it difficult is the fact that we can't control our emotions, which is a good thing. Emotions are instinctive. Imagine bearing the responsibility of having to choose your emotion in any given moment. Right? To some of you that might sound nice, right? But what if you have to choose how you feel about your child running into the street with oncoming traffic? Right? What if you have to choose to engage that process of fear and worry and anxiety and survival, and then be motivated and energized to run out into the street and do something about it, right? To save your child, essentially. Right? You don't want the responsibility of thinking, well, I don't know, car's not coming that fast, they could probably come back in time, it might not be that bad, right? Maybe a few broken bones. Right? You don't want to have to work through that process cognitively. You want your emotions to be instinctive in that moment. You want your emotions to work for you in that moment, so you don't have to waste time picking an emotion or feeling the right thing. Or excitement. That can be damaging too. I remember when we were told our families that Hannah was pregnant for the first time. It would have been devastating if they had to stop and think about what feeling they wanted to feel. Right? I mean, thankfully it wasn't that way. There was instant joy and happiness and screaming and clapping and cheering and all that. But it would have made us feel pretty bad if they were like, okay, let's think about it. Kids, Chris and Hannah. Right? But, and then finally they said, yeah, no, this is a good thing. I can be happy about this. Right? That would make a lot of people feel pretty insignificant, right? Or at least pretty unloved. So thankfully, even in those good times, we're happy, we're thankful that we don't have the burden or the responsibility of choosing our emotions. They're instinctive. But that's why it makes it difficult to control. Also, you were never meant to control your emotions. It's probably the reason why this is the most difficult. Like we talked about last week, our emotional reactions are products of our nervous system. Right? Our sympathetic nervous system ramps us up. Our parasympathetic nervous system calms us down and shows us out when we don't need to be as emotional or as charged up. So that is a God-designed, God-intended system, first and foremost, for our survival, right? So that we don't have to think about whether or not we should run from a bear, right? Or think about whether or not we should step in to protect someone or to protect our loved ones. So this is a good thing that we aren't meant to control. We're not meant to subvert the process. We're not meant to change what God had intended and designed to be a good thing. So if your focus is on controlling your emotions, you're spinning your wheels, because that isn't the point. Right? The point is that this is a good system that we've perverted. And so we want the system to work the way God intended it. We don't want to change the system. You guys following that? Does that work? That ruffle anyone's feathers? Nice.
So I'm counting on the idea that, something's going to be covered later on, because if you take that statement just by itself, it would seem like you're saying self-control is, we have no business pursuing self-control, right?
Right. That is not what I'm saying. Okay. So I'm not saying we have no business pursuing self-control. Thank you for clarifying that. We are going to talk about that. There are definitely practical steps that look more like self-control, but that's on the back end of things. Right? With this process, when it works the way it's supposed to, naturally, organically, the way God designed, we don't have to control or manipulate the end result. Right? When we love what is good, when we love what God loves, when we hate what God hates, the result of that is not something that we have to make sure is appropriate or good or healthy or godly. So the problem is that the process, we do manipulate the process. So a lot of times we do end up more worried on the back end of what damage our emotions can do to ourselves or to other people. And we do want to work on that. And we are going to talk about that tonight, but that's on the back end of things. If we love what God loves, and we use our emotions to turn us towards Him, we don't have to worry about the result that's being produced. We can have confidence and trust that it's good, right? Like our fruit of the Spirit study. The fruit of the Spirit is the fruit that is produced as a result of walking with the Spirit. That fruit is not something that we have to try and manufacture or formulate for ourselves. So 2 unhealthy emotions to dealing, or approaches to dealing with our emotions. 1, just spit it out. Emotions matter above all else. How you feel is the most important thing. We don't have to look around too hard or too far to see examples of this. We may even feel this way or think this way ourselves, using phrases like, well, you just got to vent, or you just got to let it out, or you got to let them know how you feel, or you just got to be honest, or when we Christians like, you speak the truth in love, right? A lot of times, that's just venting or complaining. A lot of times, it's just spitting out our emotions without discerning them, without using wisdom to work through them and evaluate them. We're just spitting it out. And I'm not necessarily saying these are bad things, but when we take this approach, when we think this way about emotions, we're really making the emotion itself the end goal, or the primary focus, which is not meant to be. One example I had when I was listening over, I guess, I don't say eavesdropping because they were talking right in front of me, but it was two custody officers in the prison, and they were talking about how the one lady was talking about how one of the inmates is super disrespectful and super petty with her, and her response was, "Well, if you're gonna be petty to me, I'm gonna be petty to you." Right? And that's really what this idea of letting your emotions control you, your emotions guiding and determining your actions or behaviors, right? And so as a counselor, I'm like, that's a person with issues, right? And if you counteract who they are with goodness and patience and humility, you really have the opportunity to make a difference. But when emotions matter overall, all we're trying to do then is fight emotion with emotion, fire with fire. And so, her literal response was, if you're going to be petty, then I'll show you how petty I can be. Right? And this is just acting solely on feeling and nothing else. We do this in church. I've been in churches where the main point is to feel something. I've sat under preachers where what is most important is whether or not, a lot of times you feel bad when you leave. Just that stereotypical fire and brimstone. You're not leaving here until someone feels pretty bad about themselves. I'm not altogether sure that was their point, but it definitely felt that way at times. Music can do the same thing. Emotions are good. Obviously, I'm not saying music that makes you emotional is a bad thing, but some of you may have seen or been in churches where the whole experience was meant to provoke emotion. And not necessarily, that's not necessarily what we want to be gathering for, as, for an emotional experience. Obviously, emotions do happen when we gather together, but it should be a byproduct. It should be a result of our time together and our fellowship together. Or maybe in your Bible reading, right? You do your devotions in the morning, you close your Bible, and then you just didn't feel like you got much out of it today. You don't feel good. You don't feel particularly convicted. Maybe tomorrow I'll feel something more. Those are subtle ways that we kind of just make emotions the most important thing. Or, the opposite is suck it up, and stoicism basically. Don't let your emotions show. Or emotions are a sign of weakness. Negative emotions exhibit a lack of faith or trust in God. That is one of the unhealthy approaches to understanding or dealing with your emotions, is that when you feel a negative emotion, really what you're demonstrating is a lack of faith or trust in God. Once again, we are guilty in the church of this as well at times. Now, I was talking with someone who had read a few chapters of the book that this seminar is largely based off of. And they said it's kind of difficult to get through even the first few chapters, right? Because this really flies in the face of what we were taught growing up. Negative emotions, you're a Christian. You're not supposed to feel bad about anything. You're supposed to give thanks in all things. Right? God is good and has a plan for you, so what are you worried about? What happened today? Your eternity is secure with Christ in heaven. So what are you worried about? Why are you affected by the things that happen to you on a day-to-day basis? God has forgiven all your sin. So what is there to feel guilty about? This misses the point that emotions are good and they are gifts from God that are intended to aid in our sanctification. Both positive and negative emotions. And we'll define those differently here in a second. So engaging your emotions in a healthy way starts with identifying them. And this may seem simple, may seem elementary, but I bet you there's been times in your not too recent past where you weren't able to tell someone or even say to yourself how you were feeling. Right? Sometimes the answer is just, I don't know. If you want to see someone who doesn't do that, my son, He's really good at it, right? I mean, the other day he was walking up the stairs behind Reese, and she was going slow. He said, "Oh, this is so frustrating." I'm like, you're 3 years old. I mean, why is that what comes to mind? So he doesn't have a problem. Even this morning, we were at my parents' house, and he was reprimanded for something, and he said, "Can I go upstairs?" And you're not allowed to go upstairs. And I said, "No, buddy, you know you're not allowed to go upstairs." He said, "But I just need to go up there and cry for a minute." I'm glad that he's aware of himself, but that might be a little much for a 3-year-old. But, hopefully it's paving the way for good emotional health and intelligence. But it seems simple, though, but it's really not. I mean, honestly, there have been times in my recent past where I couldn't put a finger on how I felt. And if we're going to deal with our emotions, we have to know what we're dealing with. We have to be able to call it what it is. And identifying is not evaluating. Okay, I'm going to make that point clear. We're not evaluating whether this is a good or a bad thing. We're not trying to dig down below the surface. Really, at this point, all we're trying to do is, what is the feeling I'm feeling? And then we examine, why am I feeling this way? What am I reacting to? Why is my reaction this time different than when this thing happened last time? In this step, all we want to do is just identify the catalyst or the event. Now, this is going to help in the process by beginning to point out the things that we care about. Then we want to evaluate. So, and this is probably not all going to be all bad or all good. It's going to be probably a grab bag. It's probably going to be some good things that you can point to and say, this is a good thing I care about, or this is something important that I value, or I don't like that this emotion is evidence of some selfishness in me or something like that. And so we need to figure out which aspects are good and godly, which ones are destructive and selfish. And then you want to act on it. You want to nurture the good ones, the good loves, the good behaviors, the good emotions, and starve or resist the bad ones. Now, this doesn't just mean that the focus is just on changing the emotion or behavior. Being an angry person who just focuses on not letting their anger get the best of them is a ticking time bomb. Right? We say, you can't just bottle up your feelings. One day you're going to explode. That's the result of someone just trying to control their emotions. So there are aspects and times where it's appropriate to practice some self-control and some discipline, and we'll get into that. But that is not a good framework for making your emotions work for you, for using them the way God intended them to be used. We can't just focus on not letting our emotions get the best of us, because eventually our emotions are going to get the best of us. Right? You're not in that much control of yourself to 24/7 be able to make sure that your emotions are always in check. So it's much better that you have a good system that you don't have to control versus making sure that you have to control the output or the outcome every time something arises, which is really what we want to focus on. All the internal self-awareness in the world doesn't help if it doesn't lead to change in relationship and action. So this is where I really want to highlight, because this is the most important part of the process, I think. In today's culture, especially in what you will hear from professional counselors and things like that, is there's such an emphasis on understanding why you are the way that you are. What happened to your past? Why did you react that way? What triggers you? These are all good things. I mean, these are all super helpful things to understand why you react or why you feel the way you do. But it's one stop short of growth. It's one stop short of change. And so understanding why and how you've come to be the way you are, that reacts this way or feels that way, is good and super helpful. It's a great starting point, but you have to move past that. Right? There has to be some change moving forward. And so I think there's a lot of good to understanding your past and exploring and examining your past, but we can't stop there, right? Because all that does is explain why we are the way we are. It does nothing to help change into the person God created us to be. Questions? Comments? All right. You guys are quiet tonight.
Comment, Chris, if I may, you trust God enough to bring every emotion to Him. One thing I like about the Psalms is that they're pretty raw in their emotions. They're pretty thorough in their emotions. There's every emotion imaginable in the Psalms,
Yes.
and yet it's not just fully venting them, and neither is it's not swallowing them either. But the psalmists are praying their emotions. I think that's a really good way to look at it.
Yeah, I forget who said it, but in the Psalms is, the entire scope of the human experience, especially emotionally speaking, and that is what we're going to talk about here on this slide. Those notes are a bad thing. I'll let you get ahead of me. God created us with emotions for a reason, to draw us to Himself, to delight in Him, to trust Him, to fear Him, to feel godly sorrow and guilt, to hope in Him. Speaking of the Psalms, trust in Him at all times. O people, pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us. God cares about how you feel, even when you're angry or upset. And these are one of the ways that I think a lot of people have negative experiences or feel negatively towards emotions, because we think, well, God doesn't want me to be angry. God isn't happy with me if I'm angry or upset about something. And so that's a bad thing. I just want to dismiss that, or I want to get rid of that as soon as possible. Really missing the point. And so we have David here saying, pour out your heart. Why? Because He is a refuge. Because He is our safety. He is our protection. God cares about how we feel because it's His primary source of drawing us towards Him. Lament. I think we don't talk about this a lot in church, but this is a large part of what David talks about, or what David expresses through the Psalms. As lament, right? Godly complaining. There's a formula for it. He uses his complaints to turn, in all the Psalms, all of the laments are towards God. It's an acknowledgement that God is good, and the reality that we're experiencing is missing the mark of what we think God's goodness should look like. Right? And so, to lament is uniquely Christian to begin with, because it begins with the understanding that God is good. And so it's not just complaining for complaining's sake. It's saying, God, this is what I know of you. This is what I know to be true. This is what your word says. What I'm experiencing here doesn't seem to line up with that necessarily. But so with an address to God, it's a complaint. I know that might be a bad word, but ultimately it is a complaint, but it's a complaint to God, and we use it to turn us back to God. Right? If you go back, lament. It's actually a good thing. Right? We see it a lot in the Psalms, and we see it exampled for us. I think maybe it's something that we could not be so afraid of, honestly. It's letting God know, pouring out our heart to God, and letting Him know what's really on our heart. But letting Him know that, because we know that He is good, that He is love, and He does care. And addressing Him with it, because as we address Him and we turn ourselves towards Him, we get a better picture of who He is and what reality should look like. Feeling like our feelings don't matter to God may dissuade us from turning to Him in times of intense emotion. But it's only in turning to Him in those times that we can see where we are missing the mark. So trying to develop loves and desires that align with God's heart without bringing them to God is like trying to fly by flapping your arms instead of boarding a plane. Right? Do you trust God enough to bring every emotion to Him? Jesus went and prayed to the Father when He began to feel sorrowful and troubled. Right? He tells His disciples, this is how I'm feeling. I'm going to go pray. If that was good enough for Jesus, why are we afraid of that? Why do we think that we don't have the same access, or we don't have the same Father who cares about our anxieties. You know, Peter tells us, cast all of our cares upon him, or all our anxieties on him. Why? Because he cares for us. Right? It's not just bring only your joy and your excitement and your happiness to God. Pour out your heart to him. And if you're honest, pouring out your heart isn't always going to be an expression of joy and contentment and satisfaction and praise. So, tough pill to swallow, but maybe we don't run to God with our emotions at all times because maybe we aren't fully convinced it's worth it. Maybe we aren't fully convinced that he cares enough. Maybe we're not fully convinced that he'll do something about it. Maybe we feel like we have to get our act together before we go to God. Maybe we feel like, I can't be this messy, I can't be this emotional and bring it to God. I'm going to wipe my tears, let me straighten up, let me stiffen up my upper lip, and then we'll talk to God about it. That is not pouring out your heart to God. It's putting up in front. Maybe you don't like what God's idea of a life well lived looks like. Maybe you look at your goals on earth and you see how emotions can run interference. You know, maybe you just got to suck it up when your boss gets under your skin because you want that promotion, or you walk on eggshells around your spouse because you want peace in the home. But we're forgetting the real goal here too. And the real goal is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to look more and more like Christ. And so, hiding our emotions or focusing on earthly goals where our emotions might get in the way, right? Like walking on eggshells around a person, around your spouse or whoever, just because you want things to be quiet, you want things to be peaceful, you don't want to come home from work and jump into an argument. You know, that peace isn't a bad thing, but that's not a good approach. It's a very unhealthy approach. And it's definitely not pouring out your heart to God, and it's not letting God redeem those opportunities. Every tear, sigh, explosive exhalation, grimace, or grumble taken directly to the friend who makes his home in our hearts is a taste of the fellowship we were made for. Don't keep your feelings to yourself. This is what relationships are made of. This is what we were made for. It stands to reason then that if our emotions are the way our hearts are made to align with God, our relationship with him actually ought to be the most emotional relationship we have. Does that ruffle anyone's feathers? That our relationship with God ought to be the most emotional relationship we have. Ought to be the most transparent, the most emotionally honest, the most vulnerable, the most emotional relationship that we have. Rob?
Chris, so are you saying like that there's times that we feel that God's shoulders are not strong enough to carry what we're feeling? You know, I can't go to God because, you know, like you said, I have to have it all together with God. I can't show that any weaknesses or that I have doubts.
Yeah, the question is, would you say that there are times we don't bring our emotions to God because we feel like his shoulders aren't big enough, or we have to clean ourselves up first? Yeah, I think all the above. And I think it's sad, right? It's terribly sad. First of all, it's silly because God knows our hearts anyway, right? Secondly, that's how we connect with God. That's how we know what we love. That's how we know that we care about what God cares about. And if we're in some way, shape, or form trying to hide that from God, that's a pretty clear indicator that our loves are disoriented and they need to be reoriented. Erica?
I was just going to say, I've had times where I felt guilty for feeling certain ways because you know how good God is. But like you said, and I'm like, it's so silly to think that because this is a God that knows your deepest heart's desires. So why do you try to go away from it? Like, it just, yeah.
I don't always have a good reason for why we're as illogical as we are, but
Yeah.
we are. I mean, on paper we can say, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not actually hiding anything from God.
Right.
But it's different when we don't bring it to God and say, well, I know He knows how I feel
Then
anyway,
you're closing out the
versus, yeah, exactly. Versus actually bringing it to God. That's a difference, for sure. And so, engaging emotions are a relationship. Emotions are the primary point of connection between two people. We talked about that last week. So it's important that we know how to use them to grow the relationship and not destroy it. I met with a couple here a while ago. Not anyone here, don't worry. But there was a lot of emotion in that counseling session. I think probably everyone in the building heard all the emotion. But there wasn't a lot of connection. There wasn't a lot of growth, right? So you're going to feel emotion. You're going to exhibit emotion no matter what. The point is to use it for your growth as opposed to allowing it to destroy your relationships. And so, be a little counselor here on you, but try and keep this script in mind when you're engaging emotions in your relationships. I know it might seem strange, right? It doesn't have to be verbatim. As you feel more comfortable with it, it'll sound different in your conversations. But really, if you're going to engage your emotions properly and use them to understand each other, to connect better with each other, to grow in the relationship, you really do want to go through at least these 3 points. You want to share your feelings, ask the other person to share theirs. This opens up the conversation with vulnerability instead of accusations and insults. Right? This is saying, hey, just to be honest with you, this is how I feel. It might sound silly, it might be wrong, but this is what I thought about that situation, this is how that situation made me feel. Asking the other person to share theirs using I statements. I was upset, I felt disrespected, I feel like this is what happened. There's no blame here. This is just simply how I felt. Being vulnerable signals to the other person that it's okay to talk about their feelings. It's an opportunity to show that you are willing to put the relationship over the argument or over being right. And so, if you're anything like me, most conversations, a primary point of concern is being right. And so, vulnerability really doesn't work well, doesn't collaborate well with trying to win. And so this is really a good first step to say, I'm not even concerned about being right or winning. I want you to know how I felt. I want to know how you felt. I want us to connect there, and I want us to make changes. What was it like for you? How did you feel? That's empathy. And this is wanting to understand what it was like for the other person, not just trying to imagine it. Right? Men, we say all the time, we're not mind readers. But we try to be. We try to be, right? We try and think, oh, this is how you must have felt. This is probably what was going through your mind. Well, if we're honest, a lot of times we're pretty far off. So, asking the other person, what was going through your mind? How did you feel? How did that make you feel? Hebrews 2:16 through 18 says, for surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Right? So Jesus himself understands what we are feeling, what life is like for us.
What was that reference?
That is Hebrews 2:16 through 18. And of course, in Hebrews, I want to say 4, about not having a high priest that is unable to sympathize with us. Hebrews 4. Oh, man. So we want to share our feelings. We want to ask the other person to share theirs. We want to summarize the other person's feelings. Make sure you understand what they're saying. And this also gives them the opportunity to further explain if needed. And we might be tempted to get hung up here at this point. But we have to remember that understanding and caring about how someone feels or what they're saying, it's not an agreement with what they're saying. It's just understanding, right? You don't have to agree with how they're feeling to understand how they're feeling, right? So don't get hung up in, okay, well, if I summarize back to you how you feel, and it's gonna make it seem like I'm condoning, and I'm gonna make it seem like I get it, and I think you're right, and let's work from that viewpoint. Not necessarily. At this point in time, we're not really judging or evaluating. We're just putting it out there. We're being vulnerable and honest with each other. And we're talking about how emotions connect us. If we're not willing to be honest and vulnerable, then we're missing a large part of the connection. And so we summarize the other person's feelings, and then we work towards change. We ask the question, how can we do this differently next time? Starts with repentance and forgiveness, and needs to work to bring about actual change. You know, I've had multiple appointments or sessions where I've worked couples through the script. What is it that you felt? What point were you trying to get across? Turn to the other person, same question. What did you feel? What did you try and get across? And then, have them summarize each other's statements. Honestly, because that is such a foreign script for honest conversation between two people, and at times it can be so uncomfortable. I've seen so many times where it just works itself out, right? Oh, I didn't realize that's how you felt. I didn't realize that's what you thought I was saying. I didn't realize that when I said this, it came across this way. It usually works itself out, right? But it does because it really can be so uncomfortable and so foreign that we skip that part. We want to assume what we know or what we think the other person feels. We want to work off that assumption, and really at that point we really don't have a chance of getting it right because we're starting from the wrong point to begin with. So this is the way that emotions help us connect. Without emotions, how would we express what's important to us, what scares us, what excites us, what worries us? When those values are expressed through emotion, we have a visible representation of that person's heart, and that's where we connect. Thoughts on that? All right. So then, in starving unhealthy emotions, so these are thoughts or behaviors to stop or avoid. Here's some of the practical components of understanding your emotions, making your emotions work for you. Right? We are not to be mastered by our emotions. We're not to be in submission to our emotions. Our emotions are supposed to work for us. So in order to make that a reality, we have to starve the unhealthy emotions. We have to feed or nourish the healthy ones. And so when we say unhealthy emotions, we're not necessarily talking about anger, resentment, guilt, shame, things like that. It's not anger that is negative, right? It's why you're angry that's going to determine whether it's positive or negative. If you're angry at child trafficking, right, that's a good thing. You don't want to look at that and say, I'm a Christian, I can't be angry. You want to be angry. You want that to motivate and to energize you to do something about it. You're angry when you see another person being disrespected or mistreated or bullied. You want anger in that moment to motivate you to do something about it, to either step in, to forsake your own sense of protection and safety, and worry and concern about another person. Right? So anger in itself is not negative. Feeling guilty in itself is not negative. Right? We talked about how Paul himself said, when you feel guilty for the right reasons or in the right way, it leads to salvation without repentance, or without regret, excuse me. And so you think about feeling something so negatively and the Bible saying that you won't regret it. And that really was one thing that hung me up on, my personal experience and testimony, was that I just thought there's no way I'm not going to regret the things I've done, right? But I've come to realize that to regret the things that have happened is to regret or be dissatisfied with where I'm at now, or who I am now. Right? And so if you're unhappy with who you are now, then there is a good chance that you will regret the choices and the behaviors and the decisions that led you to that point. But if you're from a good standpoint, I don't mean you're totally content with yourself and you think you've arrived and you've made it, right? But if you know that you're growing, you know that your chief goal is to walk with God and to love Him and fully enjoy Him, it takes everything you've ever done, anything you've ever been through to get to that point. To regret any of that is to be dissatisfied with the work of God in you, right? And I think that is where, Paul had the foresight to see that this is not something that you're going to regret. Doesn't mean you're not going to feel bad about it. It doesn't mean that, the harm and the damage that you've caused other people in your past or that have been done to you, you don't feel bad about. Obviously you do. But to regret it would be to wish that things were different now. And if you believe that you are where God wants you, then to wish that things were different now, is that in and of itself is regrettable. So, unhealthy emotions are emotions felt for the wrong reasons, not the emotion itself. All right? Do we go with that? Okay. So, I am my emotions. Or my emotions are who I are. The sum of you cannot be reduced to your emotions. Even when those emotions are overwhelming or they seem to take over your entire existence, this is still not who you are. Or you might be tempted to label other people by their emotions. Well, that's just Bobby. He's just grumpy. Or, that's just that person. This emotion is who they are, right? And we use it to excuse people. Oh, well, that's just so-and-so. They're just, they're just kind of rude. We just let it slide. That's just who they are. Right? Your emotions are not who you are. And if you look at Psalm 142, verses 3 and 4, David says, when my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. It's pretty downtrodden here, right? I mean, he, in this moment, he's feeling like his entire existence is what he explains here, what he describes here. There's not a soul on this planet that could care less about me. There's no one who would even recognize me, right? No one who would call me a friend or a brother. So we have that. We see that in the Psalms, or maybe someone who blames themselves for a loved one's death, right? Maybe they were driving the car and got in an accident where someone was killed, right? And that shame, that guilt, kind of becomes their identity. That they see the entire world through those lenses. It's incredibly unhealthy. Or when someone has been abused, they harbor shame and perhaps embarrassment. That can become their identity. They can see the entire world. They can view themselves, they can view God, they can view the entire world through those lenses. Right? That shame and embarrassment. That's making your emotions who you are. The sum of your emotions who you are. But if you look at the rest of the psalm, David says, I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. So he's still saying, I still feel pretty bad, right? With the lines he just wrote, just a few lines up, right? He hasn't radically changed his feeling. He still feels he's brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong to me. Bring me out of prison, that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. All right, so David is tempted, almost pulled into that trap of, this is my existence, this is who I am. I have no friends, nobody cares about me, but you are God, you are good, you are righteous, you will deal bountifully with me. Right? So he still feels the way he did, right? But he's allowing himself to think on truths that will hopefully help set right his perspective on reality. Don't act on your emotions immediately. Like we've talked about, our emotions are instantaneous and even supported in our bodies, and that's one of the ways that we survive. But we aren't animals, right? So we are not bound to our instincts. Right? Not only are we not bound to our instincts, but we're obligated, we bear the responsibility of opposing our instincts if and when necessary. So it's not just that we're not bound to them because we're not animals, but we actually have the responsibility to choose rightly. And so acting on your emotions immediately, how many times have you heard someone say, well, he made me do it, or they made me mad, or they just got under my skin? And that's one of the ways that we justify acting on our emotions. That's one of the ways that we're being slaves to our emotions. And so the reality situation is, I'll fight you over this one, nobody can make you mad, right? Because what happens and how you respond is not a direct line. There's a very important step in between. It's what you think or what you believe about what happens that produces the end result, right? So that person didn't make you mad. It's that you believe in decency, respect, treating other people the way you feel like you should be treated. You have certain values and core beliefs that are threatened or offended or violated. In that sense, that makes you mad, right? But it isn't what that person said or what that person did that made you mad. So, like I said, I believe there's entire counseling theories and approaches based off of this very principle here. And I believe wholeheartedly in this, that the consequences or the results that we experience are not the result of what happened. They're the result of how we feel about what happened. Any thoughts, questions about that?
Just kind of a dummy question here.
Yeah, I'll take one of those.
Okay. But so let's say like temper. If I am one of several in my family tree that have a characteristically short fuse, like how does that, so on your, as you've described it, it may be different for different ones of us, all those different characteristics, so that when you say something, and because of all of the things that have led to my belief system and my values, an added factor is, say, genetic inheritance. That sound right? I mean, as an added element there that I take into account because as a part of my sanctification, I need to be growing both in this awareness about myself that unlike other people, this particular situation, I might be more prone to respond this way than someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, and because of your makeup or your lineage, you may be prone to respond in a certain way, more so than the next person, right? But your biological makeup does not excuse moral responsibility, right?
Yeah.
We have, in the mental health field, definitely different diagnoses for, intermittent explosive disorder, right? People who literally just can't control their temper. We have mental health diagnosis for that, in both children and adults. And so we see that neurologically and mentally, but to allow that to act as a sufficient excuse would be, damaging really to society and to that individual, right? If we just tell that individual, this is how you are, you can't help it. You don't have to have too wild of an imagination to see where that could be pretty destructive, to both society and that individual. But certainly that does play a part.
And yet that's a lot of what we're seeing today, is it not?
Yeah, it's a lot of what we're seeing. I mean, it's a lot of, I take different trainings and seminars and classes and all that stuff. And so much of it is focused on understanding the way a person is or why the way a person is. And there's just so little about what to do with it. Really, when you go to see a professional counselor or a secular counselor, even some Christian counselors, what you're going to hear of is how to cope with life experiences and how to weed out the people that are good for your coping. Right? If anyone offends your coping mechanisms, they're toxic. Right? You need to find a way to set up boundaries. You need to find a way to distance yourself. Right? So we're really setting up a cocoon for yourself to make sure that your sensibilities are not offended, right? As opposed to using those opportunities to understand that when I am impatient, when I get angry, yes, it is a result of what is happening before my life experiences. Nevertheless, it is not necessarily true of my future, so I can't use what is true of the past to determine what may or may not be true of the future, right? And I think that's where it can get a little confusing, and I think that's where some counselors and therapists are actually more harmful than helpful, right? But there are professional counselors and psychologists who are just absolutely ridiculed for saying, hey, listen, you have a responsibility to change, to grow. You have a responsibility to make this work for you so that you can become a healthy, functioning person. Obviously, we are held to a higher standard, right? We have a responsibility to walk with God, to look like Christ, to be his hands and feet here on earth, regardless. So, but those in the counseling field, honestly, I'll tell you, they're really discredited because you can't expect someone to deal with unruly people. You can't expect people to deal with dysfunctional families or unhealthy relationships. The best advice is just boundaries or get out, which I think is unfortunate. So don't act on your emotions immediately, right? We're not animals. We are not bound to our instincts. We have the responsibility to act counter or oppositionally to our instincts if need be, but at least to choose our reactions. In the most emotional moments, especially in relationships, they're not matters of survival, right? So we can't allow that survival mechanism in our brain and our body to influence our behavior or our words when we're talking with someone we care about. Because we have to be able to distinguish that this is not a matter of life and death, right? This is a matter of love and goodness and growth in a relationship. I don't need my fight or flight response here, right? And so we need to slow down, not act on our impulses. Proverbs 15:28 says, the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Proverbs 12:16, the vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. So even if we are right, there's so much more to the relationship than just being right. Starving the impulse to act on your emotions as soon as you feel them will save you and your relationships a lot of pain. Quickly, thinking I shouldn't be feeling this way, and don't tell yourself I shouldn't be feeling this way. There can be a lot of shame that goes into feeling something, and that shouldn't be. I think as Christians, maybe more so than other people groups, we're prone to this. We shouldn't feel sad or upset or anxious. Right? What we need to do, and in some cases that may be true. Right? In some cases you shouldn't feel sad. You shouldn't be anxious. But in all cases, you need to go through the process of evaluating whether or not you should be feeling that way. What is my emotion telling me about myself? What is my emotion telling me about God? What is my emotion telling me about my neighbor? Allowing yourself to listen to your emotions with the intention of rightly discerning them is using them the way God intended. Dismissing them before you understand them is to ignore one of God's primary ways to draw you closer to Him and to live life more wisely. And then reject all or nothing thinking. Right? Life isn't black and white. Emotions are not black and white like we've talked about. They're a grab bag. Someone can love you and hurt you. Doesn't mean that they hate you. Right? It's not either love or hate. You can be anxious about work, but love your job. You can be disappointed in a day's work, but still love your job. You can love your children and get impatient with them. That doesn't mean you don't love your children because in that moment you're feeling impatient. Right? It's not all or nothing. We don't have to be that extreme. We don't have to categorize into one or the other. We have the unique perspective as Christians of knowing a good and gracious God while living in a broken and sinful world. So it's going to get messy at times, but it's not all good and it's not all bad. So this isn't a self-help seminar. right? But practicing these things will help us begin to put our emotions to work for us and use them the way God intended. So I'll stop there. We almost made it to where we were supposed to make it. So that bodes well for next time.